In the sweltering, smoke-filled basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, known as the Dungeon, a war was being fought not with guns, but with mathematics and intuition. It was May 1942, 6 months after the devastating attack that had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and the mood was tense. Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant and eccentric linguist who often worked in a red smoking jacket and slippers to battle the chill of the air conditioning, led a team of codebreakers at Station HYPO. They were listening to the radio traffic of the Imperial Japanese Navy, trying to crack the operational code known as JN-25B. While Washington was convinced the next Japanese attack would target the Aleutians or even the West Coast, Rochefort saw a different pattern. He saw a massive convergence of forces gathering for an operation designated AF. The entire fate of the Pacific War hinged on 2 letters. If AF was Hawaii, the war was lost. If AF was a tiny atoll called Midway, the Americans had a chance to set a trap. To prove his theory, Rochefort devised one of the most brilliant ruses in military history. He instructed the commander of the Midway garrison to send an unencrypted radio message stating that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. It was a simple, mundane lie, buried in routine traffic. 2 days later, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting to Tokyo that AF is short of water. The trap had snapped shut. Rochefort walked into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office and laid the proof on his desk. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming not just to take an island, but to draw out the remaining American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, and sink them in a decisive battle that would force the United States to sue for peace. The intelligence victory was absolute. For the first time in the war, the Americans knew exactly where, when, and with what force the enemy would arrive. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had devised a plan for Midway that was breathtaking in its complexity and arrogance. He assembled the largest armada the Pacific had ever seen, including 4 of his heavy fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, mobile force, crews that had never known defeat. Yamamoto's plan relied on stealth and surprise. He believed the Americans were demoralized and scattered. He assumed his fleet would be bombarding Midway before the American carriers even left Pearl Harbor. He did not know that his radio silence had been pierced, that his battle plans were being read in real time in a basement in Hawaii, or that the American carriers were already at sea, racing to a predetermined ambush point northeast of Midway known as Point Luck. The strategic gamble taken by Admiral Nimitz was immense. He was sending his entire remaining strength, 3 carriers, one of which, the Yorktown, was being held together with wooden beams and metal patches after being mauled at the Battle of the Coral Sea, against a superior enemy force. If Nimitz was wrong, or if the ambush failed, the west coast of the United States would be defenseless. There were no backup battleships, no reserve fleets. This was an all-in bet. Nimitz placed his trust entirely in the Gold Star intelligence provided by Rochefort. He ordered his commanders, Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, to apply the principle of calculated risk. Avoid exposing their force to superior numbers unless they could inflict greater damage in return. The American plan was simple. Let the Japanese strike Midway first, revealing their position, and then hit their carriers while their planes were rearming and vulnerable. As the sun set on June 3, 1942, the 2 great fleets were closing in on each other in the vast emptiness of the Central Pacific. The Japanese sailors on the Akagi were celebrating, convinced they were about to deliver the final blow to the American weaklings. They polished their planes and wrote letters home about the coming victory. Miles away on the darkened flight decks of the Enterprise and Hornet, American pilots checked their SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes. They knew the odds were against them. They knew the Zero was a superior fighter. But they had the one weapon the Japanese did not, the element of surprise. The stage was set for a collision that would not be decided by the size of the fleet, but by a specific 5-minute window that no admiral could predict, but which destiny had already marked on the clock. As the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon on the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was churned into white foam by the bows of the most powerful naval force on Earth. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was a sight of terrifying majesty. At its center steamed 4 massive aircraft carriers, the flagship Akagi, the converted battleship Kaga, and the speed demons Soryu and Hiryu. These ships were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, and the Battle of the Coral Sea. Their flight decks were crowded with the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had thousands of flight hours and who practiced their deadly art with the precision of samurai. To the Japanese commanders standing on the bridges, scanning the empty horizon, defeat was a concept that applied only to others. They were suffering from what historians would later call victory disease, a fatal overconfidence born of 6 months of unbroken conquest. They believed the Americans were demoralized, inferior, and most importantly, unaware of their presence. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force from the bridge of the Akagi, was a man of rigid doctrine and caution, but even he felt the pull of destiny. His orders from Admiral Yamamoto were complex, but the immediate objective was clear: neutralize the American air power on Midway Island to pave the way for an amphibious invasion. Nagumo believed that the American carriers, the only threat capable of stopping him, were likely still anchored at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away. He envisioned a systematic destruction of the island's defenses, followed by a leisurely wait for the American fleet to rush out in a panic, where they would be crushed by his superior battleships and aircraft. He did not know that he was sailing into a box drawn on a map by Joseph Rochefort weeks earlier. He did not know that his radio silence had been a delusion, and that every turn of his screws had been tracked by the enemy. He was a burglar breaking into a house where the owner was sitting in the dark with a shotgun, waiting for the door to open. At 04:30 a.m., the order to launch was given. The flight decks of the 4 carriers erupted into a deafening cacophony of warming engines. One by one, 108 aircraft, 0 fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate level bombers roared down the wooden decks and clawed their way into the humid morning air. It was a display of martial perfection. The planes formed up quickly and turned southeast toward Midway, a swarm of mechanical locusts intent on destruction. The pilots, wrapped in their flight suits and hachimaki headbands, looked down at the vast blue emptiness and felt invincible. They were the tip of the Emperor's spear, and they were about to strike the first blow in what they believed would be the final battle of the war. Back on the ships, the deck crews began to prepare the second wave of aircraft, arming them with torpedoes in case any American ships were spotted. It was a routine procedure, performed with the casual efficiency of men who had done this a dozen times before. However, the element of surprise which Nagumo counted on above all else evaporated before his planes even reached the island. At 05:30 a.m., a frantic voice crackled over the radio of a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane flown by Lieutenant Howard Adie. Bursting through a break in the clouds, Adie saw the nightmare scenario. The entire Japanese fleet spread out below him like toy ships in a bathtub. He keyed his mic and broadcast the message that would electrify the U.S. fleet. Carrier bearing 320, distance 180. The Japanese were found. The ambiguity was gone. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance looked at the plot board. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the Japanese to attack his ships. He didn't wait to close the distance to a safer range. In a decision that broke every rule of naval prudence, Spruance ordered his carriers to turn into the wind and launch everything they had. This decision to launch at extreme range was the pivotal moment of the morning. It meant that many American planes would not have enough fuel to return to their ships. It meant sending pilots on a one-way mission into the teeth of the world's best air defense. But Spruance calculated that his only chance of survival was to catch the Japanese carriers while they were vulnerable, specifically while they were recovering their first wave of aircraft from Midway and refueling for a second strike. He was gambling the entire Pacific Fleet on a timing window that might not even exist. As the American Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and Devastators launched from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the pilots knew the stakes. They were flying into a trap of their own making, hoping to spring it before the Kido Butai realized it was no longer the hunter, but the prey. The clock was ticking down to the most expensive 5 minutes in naval history. At 09:20 a.m., the first American strike aircraft appeared on the horizon, but they were not the high-flying dive bombers Spruance had hoped for. Instead, they were the low, lumbering shapes of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Flying the obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator, a plane so slow it could barely outrun a fast destroyer, and required a dangerously long, straight run to drop its erratic torpedoes, Waldron had defied his air group commander's course and found the Japanese fleet by sheer instinct. He led his 15 planes into the teeth of the Kido Butai without fighter escort, knowing full well it was a suicide run. As they approached the carrier Soryu, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol CAP descended upon them like wolves. Over 50 Zero fighters, the finest dogfighters in the world, swarmed the helpless Americans. The TBDs, flying at wave-top height and less than 100 knots, were sitting ducks. One by one they were smashed out of the sky, their fuel tanks exploding in balls of orange flame, their crews killed before they could even drop their torpedoes. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Of the 15 Devastators of VT-8 that attacked that morning, not a single one returned to the USS Hornet. Every plane was shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived the massacre, hiding under a seat cushion in the wreckage of his plane, watching the rest of the battle from sea level. Waldron, true to his word to his men before takeoff, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit," flew his burning plane straight at the enemy until he was blasted into the ocean. The Japanese gunners on the ships cheered as the last American torpedo plane splashed harmlessly into the sea. They believed they had repelled the American attack with ease. The Zero pilots, flushed with the thrill of the kill, circled back to their carriers, low on ammunition and fuel but high on victory. They had wiped out an entire squadron without a single Japanese ship taking a hit. However, the slaughter was not over. Just as VT-8 was annihilated, Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, arrived on the scene. Like Waldron, Lindsay had no fighter cover. Like Waldron, he attacked anyway. The Zeros, still buzzing at low altitude from killing VT-8, simply turned their guns on the newcomers. The air over the Japanese fleet became a chaotic swirl of tracers and smoke. Lindsay's squadron was mauled, losing 10 of its 14 aircraft. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, from the Yorktown arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. They too were dragged into the meat grinder. The Japanese defense was functioning perfectly. The Combat Air Patrol was stripping the attackers, and the shipboard anti-aircraft guns were putting up a wall of steel. To the Japanese commanders on the bridge of the Akagi, it seemed the Americans were throwing their lives away in a disjointed, amateurish assault that posed no real threat to the Imperial Navy. But amidst the carnage, a fatal tactical error was being committed, invisible to the Japanese admirals but crucial to the outcome of the war. By attacking in 3 successive waves at sea level, the American torpedo squadrons had acted as a magnet, drawing the entire Japanese fighter cover down to the deck. Every Zero in the sky was now flying at less than 1,000 feet, preoccupied with chasing the slow, weaving torpedo bombers. They had abandoned the high altitude. Furthermore, the Japanese lookouts were fixated on the horizon, their binoculars trained on the low-flying threats skimming the waves. The anti-aircraft directors had depressed their guns to point at the sea. The protective umbrella over the fleet had been pulled down, leaving the skies above 15,000 feet completely empty and unmonitored. The invincible defense had a fatal gap, created by the blood of the torpedo pilots. This unintentional coordination was the turning point. The sacrifice of VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3 was not in vain. They had exhausted the Zero's ammunition, distracted the lookouts, and forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, preventing them from launching their own counterstrike. The flight decks of the Akagi and Kaga were now cluttered with fully fueled and armed planes, surrounded by unsecured ordnance and fuel hoses, as the crews frantically tried to rearm for a strike against the American fleet. The Japanese were at their most vulnerable moment. Their guard was down, their decks were powder kegs, and their eyes were looking the wrong way. At 10:20 a.m., the sky was clear of torpedo planes, and a silence briefly fell over the fleet. Then, a lookout on the Kaga looked up, screamed, and pointed straight overhead. The clouds had parted, and the angel of death was diving. High above the slaughter of the torpedo squadrons, at 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was fighting a battle against his own fuel gauge. Leading the Enterprise Air Group, 30 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from squadrons VS-6 and VB-6, McClusky had been searching the empty ocean for hours. He had flown to the intercepted coordinates, found nothing but blue water, and pushed his search pattern to the absolute limit of his aircraft's range. His pilots were tapping their gauges nervously. Many were already running on fumes, and the decision to turn back to the carrier seemed inevitable. If they turned back now, the Japanese fleet would remain undiscovered, and the Battle of Midway would be lost. But then, McClusky spotted a tiny white wake cutting through the vast expanse of the Pacific. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, racing at full speed to rejoin the main fleet after being delayed by a depth charge attack on the American submarine Nautilus. In a decision that would change the course of the 20th century, McClusky decided to follow that lone white streak. He banked his formation and followed the breadcrumb left by the destroyer, gambling the lives of his men on a hunch. 15 minutes later, the gamble paid off with a sight that stopped the hearts of every American pilot. Through gaps in the cumulus clouds, the entire Kido Butai was revealed. 4 massive carriers, surrounded by a ring of battleships and cruisers, churning white wakes as they maneuvered to evade the torpedo attacks below. Crucially, the Japanese combat air patrol, the swarm of deadly Zeros, was nowhere to be seen at altitude. They had all descended to sea level to massacre the torpedo planes, leaving the high heavens completely undefended. It was a golden moment, a lapse in defense so rare and catastrophic that it seemed almost divine. Coincidentally, at that exact same moment, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie arrived from the northeast with 17 dive bombers from the USS Yorktown. Without any radio coordination, 2 separate American air groups had arrived over the same target, at the same time, from different angles, with the sun behind them and the enemy looking the wrong way. The trap was not just set, it was perfect. At 10:22 a.m., the lead planes pushed over into their dives. The sensation of a dive-bombing run in an SBD Dauntless was a physical assault on the senses. The pilots opened their split flaps, dive brakes that perforated the air to keep the plane steady, and the aircraft shuddered as it pitched forward into a near-vertical 70-degree drop. The altimeters unwound frantically. 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet. Gravity slammed the pilots against their harnesses as the ocean rushed up to meet them at 270 knots. Through their telescopic sights, the flight decks of the Japanese carriers grew from the size of matchboxes to the size of city blocks. What the pilots saw on those decks was a target rich beyond their wildest dreams. The carriers were fully laden with aircraft refueling and rearming for a strike against the American fleet. The decks were covered in high-octane aviation fuel hoses, unsecured bombs, and torpedoes. The Kaga and the Akagi were essentially floating powder kegs waiting for a match. The first group, led by McClusky and Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, roared down upon the Kaga, the massive converted battleship. The Japanese lookouts screamed warnings, but it was too late. The anti-aircraft guns could not elevate fast enough to track the diving banshees. The first bomb missed, splashing harmlessly off the starboard bow, but the next 3 were direct hits. One 1,000-pound bomb smashed into the Kaga's superstructure, killing the captain and the entire bridge crew instantly. Another penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, setting off secondary explosions among the fueled aircraft and stored torpedoes. The ship was instantly transformed into a blast furnace. A column of fire and debris shot 1,000 feet into the air. The Kaga, the pride of the fleet, had been gutted in 30 seconds. Simultaneously, a tactical error by the Enterprise Group, where nearly all planes dived on the Kaga, was corrected by the quick thinking of Lieutenant Richard Dick Best. Realizing the flagship Akagi was being ignored, Best pulled out of his dive signaled his two wingmen to follow, and executed a shallow, high-speed attack on Admiral Nagumo's carrier. Best released his bomb at 1,500 feet. It was a masterpiece of precision. The bomb smashed through the flight deck near the midship elevator and exploded in the upper hangar deck. It set off a chain reaction of devastating force, igniting the fuel tanks of the torpedo planes parked below. The blast blew the elevator completely off its hinges and turned the Akagi into a roaring inferno. Meanwhile, miles away, Max Leslie's Yorktown bombers hammered the Soryu with 3 lethal hits, blowing the ship apart. At 10:20 a.m., Japan was winning the war. By 10:25 a.m., 3 of its 4 heavy carriers were burning wrecks, their crews incinerated, their planes destroyed, and the Empire's dominance in the Pacific shattered forever. While the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were reduced to drifting infernos, consumed by uncontrollable fires and exploding ordnance, one Japanese carrier remained untouched by the American onslaught, the Hiryu, Flying Dragon. Commanded by the fierce and brilliant Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a man widely considered to be Admiral Yamamoto's likely successor, the Hiryu was positioned miles away from the main group, hidden under a cloud bank that had miraculously spared it from the dive bombers' sights. While Admiral Nagumo stood in shock on the burning bridge of the Akagi, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his fleet, Yamaguchi wasted no time in mourning. He was a warrior of the old school, aggressive and unyielding. He realized instantly that the survival of the Imperial Navy depended on striking back immediately, before the Americans could recover their planes. With cold determination, he signaled the fleet. "All is not yet lost. I am attacking." At 10:50 a.m., he launched his first wave of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. Their mission was simple: find the American carriers and trade a life for a life. The Japanese counterstrike followed the retreating American planes back toward their fleet, using them as unwitting guides to the target. They soon spotted the USS Yorktown, Task Force 17's flagship, steaming hard to the northeast. The Yorktown was already a wounded beast, patched together after the Battle of the Coral Sea, but her radar picked up the incoming raid at a distance of 40 miles. The American Combat Air Patrol, CAP, of Wildcat fighters tore into the Japanese formation, shooting down over half of the attackers before they could even begin their dives. However, the surviving Japanese pilots were the elite of the elite, the gods of naval aviation. 7 Vals broke through the screen and commenced their dives. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft gunners put up a curtain of steel, but the Japanese pressed home their attack with suicidal bravery. 3 bombs struck the carrier. One blew a hole in the flight deck, another pierced the smokestack and exploded in the boiler uptakes, extinguishing the fires in the engines. The great ship shuddered, lost power, and rolled to a stop. Black smoke billowed into the sky. To the Japanese pilots circling above, the Yorktown appeared doomed, a burning wreck dead in the water. They radioed back to Yamaguchi. Enemy carrier burning and sinking. What followed was one of the greatest feats of damage control in naval history. On board the Yorktown, the repair crews worked with superhuman speed and desperation. They patched the flight deck with massive steel plates, shored up the bulkheads with timber, and, most critically, relit the boilers in the suffocating heat of the engine rooms. Within an hour, the dying ship had raised steam and was moving again, working her way up to 20 knots. The smoke cleared, the fires were extinguished, and a fresh combat air patrol was launched. When Admiral Yamaguchi's second wave of aircraft, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, arrived on the scene at 2:30 p.m., they were confused. They were looking for a burning wreck. Instead, they found an operational carrier steaming aggressively and launching planes. They assumed this must be a second American carrier, the Enterprise or the Hornet. They did not realize they were attacking the same ship that had supposedly been destroyed just hours earlier. The Yorktown was a ghost ship, refusing to die. Lieutenant Tomonaga, flying with a damaged fuel tank that meant he could never return to the Hiryu, led the torpedo attack with fatal precision. He split his squadron to attack the Yorktown from both sides simultaneously, a classic anvil attack that made evasion impossible. The Yorktown's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, maneuvered the ship violently, combing the wakes of 2 torpedoes, but the net was too tight. 2 long-lance torpedoes slammed into the portside amidships. The explosions were catastrophic. They ripped open the hull, destroyed the power generation systems, and jammed the rudder. The ship immediately took on a severe list to port, rolling 23 degrees within minutes. The lights went out, the pumps failed, and the ocean rushed in. The Fighting Lady, which had survived Coral Sea and the first dive bomber attack, finally succumbed to the underwater hammer blow. As the list became critical and the risk of capsizing grew imminent, Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Thousands of sailors slid down lines into the oil-slicked water or scrambled into rafts, watching their beloved carrier wallow helplessly in the swell. However, the Yorktown still did not sink. She remained afloat, a stubborn testament to American engineering and grit. Meanwhile, back on the Hiryu, the surviving pilots landed and reported a great victory. 2 American carriers sunk, in reality, the same one twice. Admiral Yamaguchi believed he had evened the score, 2 carriers lost on each side. He prepared to launch a 3rd wave at twilight to finish off the last American ship. But he was operating on false data. The Americans still had 2 fully operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, and their scouts had just located the Hiryu, alone and vulnerable, sailing into the setting sun. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. As the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the western horizon on June 4, 1942, the USS Enterprise was a hive of frantic, deadly activity. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the cool-headed intellectual of the fleet, knew that the job was not finished. His scouts had located the Hiryu, the 4th and final Japanese carrier, steaming defiantly to the north. Spruance understood the stakes. If the Hiryu escaped into the night, she could return to fight another day, or worse, launch a night attack that could cripple the American fleet. He ordered a maximum effort strike, scraping together every flyable SBD Dauntless he had left. This strike force was a grim orphanage of the air, a mixed bag of pilots from the Enterprise and refugees from the sinking Yorktown who had landed on his deck hours earlier. These men were exhausted, dehydrated, and flying on pure adrenaline. Led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, they took off into the blinding glare of the setting sun, fueled by a cold, vengeful fury. They weren't just soldiers following orders. They were executioners sent to deliver the final verdict on the Imperial Japanese Navy. Aboard the Hiryu, the mood was a surreal mix of exhaustion and delusional optimism. The crew had been fighting for 12 hours straight. They had launched 2 successful strikes against the Yorktown and believed they had sunk 2 different American carriers, evening the score. They were now preparing for a 3rd strike, a twilight attack that Admiral Yamaguchi hoped would finish off the last American ship. The pilots were eating rice balls on the flight deck, the mechanics were fueling the few remaining planes, and the lookouts were straining their eyes against the glare of the eastern horizon. But the danger didn't come from the east, it came from the sun. At 5:00 p.m. the lookouts screamed, but it was too late. The American dive bombers, using the sun as a blinding shield, were already in their 70-degree dives before the Japanese guns could even track them. The Hiryu, the Flying Dragon, was about to be grounded forever. The attack was a textbook example of annihilation. The Hiryu twisted and turned, her captain attempting to throw off the aim of the diving Dauntlesses, but the American pilots were in no mood to miss. 4 1,000-pound bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. The damage was horrific and instantly fatal. One bomb struck the forward elevator with such force that it blew the massive steel platform completely out of its well and hurled it backward, where it landed against the ship's bridge, blocking the view of the helmsman. Another bomb penetrated deep into the hangar deck, detonating among the fully fueled aircraft preparing for the twilight strike. The explosion lifted the flight deck like a tin roof in a hurricane. Within minutes, the Hiryu was a roaring inferno from bow to stern. The fires were so intense that the paint on the hull blistered and peeled, and men were forced to jump into the sea to escape the heat radiating through the steel decks. The Dragon was not just burning, it was melting. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the aggressive genius who had hoped to lead the fleet to victory, watched his ship die with a stoic samurai calm. He realized instantly that the battle, and perhaps the war, was lost. The Kido Butai, the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to 4 burning pyres in a single day. Yamaguchi, unlike Nagumo, did not flee to a destroyer. He decided to remain with his ship, a decision that deprived Japan of its most capable carrier commander. As the fires consumed the superstructure, Yamaguchi and the ship's captain, Tomeo Kaku, gathered the surviving crew on the flight deck. In a surreal ceremony illuminated by the flames, they led the men in 3 cheers of banzai for the emperor. Yamaguchi gave his final orders: "Abandon ship, I shall remain." He then shared a final toast of water with Kaku, tied himself to the bridge railing to ensure he would not float free, and waited for the end. It was a gesture of ancient feudal loyalty in the middle of a modern industrial slaughter. The Hiryu lingered through the night, a burning beacon in the dark ocean, before finally slipping beneath the waves the next morning. Her sinking marked the absolute destruction of the First Air Fleet. In a span of 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and most critically over 3,000 men, including the irreplaceable mechanics and veteran pilots who had trained for a decade to master naval aviation. The spear of the Empire had been snapped in half. As the American pilots returned to the Enterprise and Hornet, landing in the dark on pitching decks, they were too tired to celebrate. They simply collapsed in the ready rooms, smoking cigarettes and staring at the bulkheads, slowly processing the magnitude of what they had done. They had flown into the teeth of the dragon, and against all odds, they had slain it. Hundreds of miles behind the burning carrier force, aboard the world's largest battleship, the Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in a stunned silence that permeated the entire bridge. For hours, the wireless operators had been handing him fragments of a nightmare. Akagi burning, Kaga exploding, Soryu sinking, Hiryu lost. The main body, a massive fleet of battleships intended to finish off the Americans after the carriers had softened them up, was now steaming into a void. Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the man who had warned the emperor that he could only guarantee 6 months of victory, saw his prophecy coming true with terrifying precision. It was almost exactly 6 months since December 7th. The decisive battle he had sought to destroy the American fleet had instead destroyed his own air arm. The Kido Butai, the sword of the Empire, was gone. Yet Yamamoto was a gambler by nature, and he initially refused to accept the totality of the defeat. He believed that if he could lure the American fleet into a night engagement, his massive 18-inch guns could still crush the lighter American carriers in a surface battle. Yamamoto ordered his heavy surface fleet to race eastward at full speed, hoping to catch the Americans in the dark. He knew that Japanese optical sights and night fighting training were superior to anything the U.S. Navy possessed. If he could bring his battleships within gun range of the Enterprise and Hornet, the loss of his carriers would become a secondary detail. He would simply blast the Americans out of the water with high-explosive shells. It was a desperate, bloodthirsty strategy born of denial. He broadcast orders to his submarine fleet to form a picket line, and ordered the cruiser force to shell Midway Island to provoke a reaction. The Yamato surged through the swells, her bow wave rising high as she pushed her engines to the red line. The entire Japanese strategy shifted from air dominance to a chaotic, majestic charge of the heavy metal, a final attempt to salvage victory from the jaws of catastrophe through sheer brute force. However, the American commander, Admiral Raymond Spruance, was not the reckless amateur Yamamoto hoped he was. Spruance possessed a cool, calculating intellect that would earn him the reputation as the premier naval strategist of the war. He correctly anticipated Yamamoto's trap. As night fell on June 4th, Spruance did not chase the retreating Japanese fleet to the west, nor did he hold his position. Instead, he turned his task force east away from the enemy, withdrawing his precious carriers to safety for the night. He knew that in a night battle his planes were useless and his ships would be vulnerable to Japanese torpedoes and battleships. He refused to play Yamamoto's game. By turning east, he ensured that when the sun rose on June 5th, the distance between the fleets would be too great for the Japanese battleships to engage, but close enough for American aircraft to launch another strike if necessary. It was a masterclass in knowing when to fold. Spruance preserved the victory he had won in those 5 minutes, rather than risking it all in the dark. At 02:55 a.m. on June 5th, the reality of the situation finally penetrated the fog of war on the Yamato's bridge. Reports from scout planes and destroyers confirmed that the American fleet was nowhere to be found. They had vanished to the east. Yamamoto realized that the trap had failed. If he continued to steam toward Midway, dawn would bring not a surface battle, but waves of American dive bombers falling on his defenseless battleships. He would be sailing his remaining fleet into a meat grinder without air cover. The silence on the bridge was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the distant crash of the sea. With a face like a stone mask, Yamamoto turned to his staff and uttered the words that signaled the end of Japan's offensive expansion in the Pacific. The Midway operation is cancelled. He ordered the fleet to turn around and head back to Japan. It was the first time in 350 years that a Japanese naval armada had been defeated. The great alligator of the Pacific was retreating, wounded and bleeding, leaving its teeth at the bottom of the sea. The retreat was a grim procession of shame and sorrow. Before leaving the area, the Japanese destroyers had to perform one final heartbreaking duty. They had to scuttle their own burning flagships. The Akagi and Soryu, still afloat but gutted by fire, could not be allowed to fall into American hands. Japanese torpedoes were fired into the hulls of the ships that had once been the pride of the nation. As the great carriers slipped beneath the waves, taking hundreds of trapped sailors and the dreams of an empire with them, the surviving captains and admirals on the destroyers wept openly. The detailed logs, the battle flags, and the portraits of the emperor went down with the ships. The fleet that limped back to Hiroshima was a ghost of the one that had left weeks earlier. The sailors were ordered to remain silent. The wounded were quarantined in secret hospitals to prevent rumors from spreading. The Japanese government would lie to its people, claiming a great victory, but the men on the ships knew the truth. The sun had set in the east and a long dark storm was coming from the west. When the smoke finally cleared over the Central Pacific on June 7, 1942, the strategic landscape of World War II had been inverted with a violence that shocked capitals around the globe. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had rampaged unchecked across a third of the Earth's surface for 6 months, conquering Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, had run into a wall of American steel and resolve. The scorecard was catastrophic. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Soryu, 1 heavy cruiser, Mikuma, over 250 aircraft, and 3,057 men. The United States had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, Hammond, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. But the numbers only told half the story. The loss of the Kido Butai was not just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic amputation. The mobile force was the only instrument Japan possessed capable of projecting power across the vast distances of the Pacific. Without it, the empire could no longer expand. The perimeter had been set, and from this day forward, Japan would be fighting a defensive war, reacting to American moves rather than dictating the tempo of battle. The sun of the Japanese Empire had reached its zenith at 10:20 a.m. on June 4th and had immediately begun its long, bloody descent into twilight. The most profound loss for Japan was not the ships, but the men. The pilots of the First Air Fleet were the samurai of the sky, an elite cadre trained with a rigor and brutality that no other nation could match. They were irreplaceable. It took years to train a Japanese naval aviator to the standard of a Pearl Harbor veteran. At Midway, hundreds of these experts, along with the highly skilled mechanics and armorers who kept the planes flying, were incinerated in the hangar decks or drowned in the dark ocean. Japan's pilot training program, rigid and elitist, could not produce replacements fast enough to fill the empty cockpits. In contrast, the United States was already churning out thousands of pilots in a massive, industrialized training pipeline. The brain drain at Midway meant that the quality of the Japanese air arm began a terminal decline. The Turkey shoot of the Mariana Islands in 1944 was a direct result of the slaughter of the veterans in 1942. The sword of the Empire had not just been blunted, the arm wielding it had been severed. Midway also marked the awakening of the American industrial juggernaut. Admiral Yamamoto had famously warned his government that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no expectation of success. Midway happened almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The battle brought the United States the one thing it needed most: time. By stopping the Japanese advance in 1942, Nimitz and Spruance secured the safety of the West Coast and the supply lines to Australia. This breathing room allowed the American shipyards to shift into high gear. While Japan struggled to repair its damaged ships, the US was laying the keels for the Essex-class carriers, a fleet of 24 new fast carriers that would swarm the Pacific by 1943. Midway proved that the US Navy could stand toe-to-toe with the enemy's best and win. The psychological paralysis of Pearl Harbor was exorcised. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, armed with a terrible resolve and looking west toward Tokyo. The victory was also a triumph of intellect over arrogance. The Battle of Midway was won in the basement of Station HYPO, as much as it was in the skies over the fleet. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers proved that information is the deadliest weapon of all. By cracking JN-25B and devising the freshwater ruse, they allowed Nimitz to gamble his outnumbered fleet with the certainty of a card counter at a blackjack table. The Japanese failure was a failure of imagination. Suffering from victory disease, they believed the Americans were incapable of surprise. They ignored security, broke radio silence, and assumed the enemy would behave exactly as they predicted. Midway taught the world that in modern warfare, the unseen battlefield of the electromagnetic spectrum is just as critical as the visible one. The fog of war had been lifted for the Americans, while the Japanese were sailing blind into their own funeral. In the final analysis, the Battle of Midway stands as a testament to the fragility of history. The entire outcome of the Pacific War and the fate of millions of people turned on a specific 5-minute window between 10:20 and 10:25 a.m. If McClusky had turned back 5 minutes earlier due to low fuel, if the Japanese scout plane had launched on time, if the torpedo squadrons hadn't drawn the Zeros down to sea level, the result would have been the destruction of the US fleet and the probable fall of Hawaii. It was a victory of margins decided by the courage of men like Wade McClusky, John Waldron, and Dick Best, who pushed their machines and their bodies beyond the breaking point. The burning hulks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu resting at the bottom of the Pacific are the silent monuments to the moment when the irresistible force of the Japanese Empire met the immovable object of American grit. The tide had turned, and it would not stop rising until the surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay.